Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first panel discussion of day 2 of the Digital State of the Nation. And this session is on global trade and supply chains. I'm Jarrod Ball, Chief Economist at CEDA, and it's my absolute pleasure to be facilitating today's discussion. Just like all our public events, you can interact with our participants, and there's 3 ways that you can do that. Firstly, you can follow CEDA on Twitter, CEDA_news, and join the conversation using the hashtag SON2020. You'll also be able to ask questions of our participants on Pigeonhole, our platform for these questions. Details are on the live stream page, and you can go to the website ceda.pigeonhole.at using the passcode SON2. So I'd encourage you to get your questions in there. There's also today a poll question, Pigeonhole. And that poll question is, with trade down between 10 and 30% due to the pandemic, do you believe that Australia can successfully influence free movement of goods and services at a time when protectionism is on the rise? I look forward to people weighing in on that poll question and revealing the results later on in the discussion. Anyone who has been following the recent disruptions in global trade and supply chains brought on by COVID-19 will know that discussion and debate here in Australia has evolved very quickly. In February, we were assessing the disruption to supply chains from shutdowns in Wuhan and manufacturing plants in China, as well as disruption to our exports into those markets. By March, we started to see signs of recovery in Chinese production, but our concerns shifted to the global race for medical and essential goods. And in April, debate turned to how Australia could become more self-sufficient given the disruptions experienced. And since May, we have been very focused on global trade tensions. So to disentangle some of these issues, to understand where Australia is at and how we should be navigating our way out of these disruptions, I'm joined by 2 people, experts who've been right at the centre of these developments in recent months. And I'd like to extend a warm but socially distant welcome to Dr. Stephanie Fahey, Chief Executive Officer of Austrade, and also Alexandra Riha, President and Chair of the Australasian Supply Chain Institute. Now, we're going to have about 20 minutes of facilitated discussion, but then we will be going to Q&A. So as the discussion progresses, I would certainly encourage you to jump on Pigeonhole and get your questions in so that we can start to tackle those after 20 minutes. So I think I'll start with you, Stephanie, perhaps from the kind of macro trade perspective. As I said, this has moved very quickly. We saw a frenzy of headlines. It feels a little bit like things have subsided a bit now. Where you're sitting, how are our exporters faring? Are we out of the woods yet? And what's the next 6 months kind of look like in terms of the risks and issues that we'll be facing, do you think?
Thanks, Jarrod. So there's no doubt that Australian exporters are doing it tough. We first had the impact of the drought, which was extended over many, many years. Then we had the bushfires that came in on top, and now we've got COVID-19. And that's impacted exporters in this country. But I think we can be quietly optimistic about the future. I think there's a number of government strategies that have been put in place that is trying to not only flatten the curve of COVID-19 infection, but also flatten the impact on the economy. But if I'm to speak about exporters in general, we say exporters are doing it tough, but it is quite diverse. So those exports, goods exports that were going by ship have not been immediately impacted. So if we look at resources, for example, and 70% of Australia's goods exports are resources. But there is a group of goods exports that have been dependent on air freight, and not air freight specifically where you've got air freight carriers, pardon me, most of our air freight actually went in the belly of planes, passenger planes. And in a sense, the passenger tickets subsidised the air freight. So with the almost complete cancellation of passenger planes as we've progressed through these months, it's really impacted on the capability of our exporters, and particularly of perishable products, to get their product to the market. So that is the goods exporters. But then when we also look at our services exporters, and our two major exports in terms of services, international tourism and international education. And again, they're connected to passenger planes. So as borders close, all of those industries have been very deeply impacted. But I'd like to make the point that it's not all bad news. And some of you will be aware that in the last couple of months, Austrade has become an air freight business. So we've been working together with the airlines and also with freight forwarders to get some of the premium product from Australia out into our markets. So these are products like lobster, coral trout, oysters, strawberries, table grapes, and we've been able to send those products out. But just as importantly, the return flights were commissioned to bring back what we call PPE and medicine. So the perishable product going out, medicine, PPE coming in, and that program, we call it IFAM, the International Freight Assistance Mechanism, has actually created a lifeline for many of our exporters.
Thanks, Stephanie. And is there a sort of vigilance, I guess, over coming up concerns around second waves of infection potentially in some countries and things like that? Are people still a little bit on edge about what else might kind of come at them?
I think we've always been concerned about a second wave from the very beginning, and we've done scenario planning not only for post-COVID, but the fact that we might have a second wave, or that we may just have to live with COVID-19. So the planning that's been done by government and by others who have been interested in this area have looked at several different scenarios. The second wave, we're starting to see some evidence of that in Beijing at the moment. You'll be aware that over the weekend, they reported that there was COVID-19 outbreak in one of their major fresh food markets, and that will affect Australian product. So it is certainly very challenging times and very uncertain times, because you've got economies that are expanding and contracting, borders that are opening, closing. So to have certainty about the future is impossible. So from the Australian point of view, what we need to do is to take this as an opportunity to think about how we can best navigate and how we can be most agile and nimble in this very uncertain time. We don't have control over the uncertainty, but we do have control over how we support our businesses and help direct our businesses into niche markets.
So a really good point about the kind of radical uncertainty, I guess, as Mervyn King and others would put it, that we now face in a range of areas, and how we prepare for that. It was interesting when you mentioned that it's not all bad news, and I want to mention Alexandra on that note. One of the perhaps silver linings some of these disruptions has been that it's really elevated the role of supply chains and logistics managers and expertise, and up to the executive and board level as well. Alexandra, how are your seeing the current environment, and are they operating on the basis that this, or are they expecting further disruption, and what's sort of keeping them awake at night at the moment?
Good morning, Jarrod. I'm very delighted to be here on this forum, on this panel, on behalf of ASCI. And I felt I just need to mention as well that ASCI, Australia's Asian Supply Chain Institute, shares the same age bracket. So it's really nice to be here. And talking about supply chain management is nowadays really in everywhere. Everybody talks about supply chain management. And also I think, just as Stephanie has mentioned, it's all about supply chain management at this very moment. But I would like to emphasize that as a supply chain manager, we're always dealing with risks. Our day-to-day task is to work and mitigate on risks. And there's also a saying, supply chain management being an essential service, no news is good news. And currently we hear a lot of supply chain. So surveys have shown that 99% of global companies have faced supply disruptions in the last 5 years. And a survey among our members, even pre-COVID, showed that 11% of our members have weekly disruptions. In average, in Australia, 10 supply disruptions a year, or disruptions in the supply chain management. They can be manifold, not like as the big disaster we have with COVID currently, but there could be supplier delays, quality issues, freight issues as well, were well pointed out, but also a big change in demand. And supply chain has faced also other disruptions already in the last months, years. With new business models, we have seen a lot of switch to internet technology, but all over the place. Bushfires, earthquakes, and it immediately had a big impact on finances. And now COVID-19 made it even just much more clearer. Everything is interlinked, this global interconnectivity. So it made it clear, even we face COVID in Australia or overseas, and a change in Brazil or in Japan or in China or India might impact our supply into Australia or into or export. It shows the huge vulnerability. But I believe the most scariest thing is the lack of visibility, because as human beings, we like to be in control and know where we are. So nowadays with COVID-19, we face all the risks at all ends. So we have it on the supply side. We most likely don't know exactly what the sub-suppliers of our suppliers do. We don't know how our customers evolve, how their demand is evolving. And freight, how do we get the services, the products from the supplier to the customer, how can we serve our customer best? It's quite a complex situation, and I think there are many companies at the moment which face the worst situation ever. So being out of stock for products in high demand, which haven't been forecasted, and on the other side, having overstock, which hits very hard the balance sheet. Looking forward to the next 6 months, I believe it will be challenging. It will be bumpy, but I'm very pleased about all these policies, government policies that have been put into place. And I'm positive because I believe we have seen most of it, and we are now much better prepared. I believe there will be surprises, but never anymore the surprises at this scale as we just had.
And maybe if I could stick with you for a minute there, Alexandra, you've just touched on the issue of oversupplies and overstocking and the impact that has on balance sheets. we've obviously seen a lot of the debate focus on this issue of greater redundancy in supply chains and, moving away from perhaps the focus on just in time. It seems to me there's a little bit of a balance there, and perhaps this could shift over time, that inevitably there is great global competition, intense demand, and consumers also, as you've kind of touched on, have their demands and want things quickly. How do you see this kind of balance evolving over time between having greater redundancy but continuing to be, ultra competitive and lean? It seems to me that those two things are going to come into a bit more tension over coming months and years.
Yeah, I think we have all heard the saying or the quote as well, that it's not the organizations that are competing, it is the supply chains that are competing. And I believe this will continue also after COVID. We must recall that our priorities or our supply chains were set up to be faster, cheaper, leaner, keeping as few inventory as possible. And we worked with a huge outsourcing strategy just to focus on focusing on core competences within a company. That was the basic guidance. That's how we lived the last 20, 30 years since the globalization intensified. And we know all these factors I just mentioned. Any slight change will immediately impact the bottom line, will impact the company or country's result, how you call it. And I believe with developing new business strategies, we need to keep this all in mind. The keywords agile, flexible, or customer-centric are very often used nowadays. And I want to use an analogy of to see what we mean by that, especially if you are considering to a new business strategies. I would like to borrow the expressions or the pictures from supply chain, from freight. You can use a vessel and a speedboat. So now the future strategies can be, do we stick to a big vessel to put it on sea, which can take large goods? We have all the economies of scale. Or are we going to work with speedboats who can go to any board quickly, those speedboats can stop faster, they can change direction much quicker, but they are much more expensive. So I believe this will be very critical in future to decide how we want to go, and once we change the strategy for the new normal, given the COVID impact going on. The other point I would like to mention is also our relationships with our suppliers, or a part of clearly customers, which are important. But I believe strongly that there needs to be a shift in this relationship with your vendor suppliers towards a partnership, win-win. That's my focus. And we have seen already now companies who have worked with their suppliers in a win-win situations, a real partnership, managed much better the crisis because they were able to attain information much quicker, and there was much better visibility around the issues. Clearly, there are also strategies of procurement strategies to even extend the supplier base. The other factors are clearly the enablers, and it has been mentioned many times already, technology. So technology is impacting supply chain. It's a big support. It's an enabler. And I believe strongly technology will help us a lot, but it will be mainly the people who will work with this technology and who will support these processes. I believe also very strongly in processes because that helps. That's a key competency we have in supply chain management as well. We have different IBP, integrated business plannings, SNOP processes, you name it all. I'm very sure everybody is aware of these tools. We can have them very simple on Word, Excel, or notebooks, or also in highly technical ERP systems. All this, the future and the balance between consumer, supply, and the future, also in this intense globalization that we are living at, will depend on a very good supply chain design. And it will be really depending on the people who design it, who can properly measure and bring in the outside in and inside out to connect that. So supply chains will always depend on people, how they implement it.
Thanks, Alexandra. And it does look like some questions are starting to come through. So I might just go back to this. Stephanie, the balance point is not just on the kind of logistics and supply chain side, it's on the trade side, and certainly some of the early discussion and debate was not really nuanced. It was sort of, putting the strength of domestic industries and being self-sufficient at odds with trading relationships. How do you think we get this debate right into around the fact that we do need to maintain these important global trade links and stay open? It's been a big part of Australia's economic development. But try and add a few things to the economic bow as well. See this debate shape.
I think it's a very important question, and as you say, there are many points of view being expressed at the moment. But what we know for certain is that it's not simple, and there's no linear solution to the issue that's confronting us. The accepted wisdom has always been to have lean inventory and extended supply chains. But then we saw how this played out when the pandemic started to hit the Australian economy. So we started to have conversations around whether we should have just-in-time production or whether we should have just-in-case production. I think there are a few killer facts that emerged at the beginning of the pandemic. The one that everyone felt was the supermarket. You go to the supermarket, what happened to the toilet paper? Why wasn't the toilet paper there 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later? So it illustrated to the whole country we've got sluggish supply chains. But then when we digged into the data in more detail, we also see that 90% of Australia's medicine is imported. 22% of that comes from the US. But when we're so reliant on our medicines coming from overseas, there is need for a discussion around how can we actually be better prepared. So I can understand those who are saying we should be reshoring our manufacturing, we should be building our own sovereignty. But as we also know, that comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of the increased redundancy within the supply chain, so it makes the products more expensive. We also know that if we're producing all of our own needs, then by definition, we're not necessarily going to have the very best in the world. So during the 1950s, we had a protected economy, and Australia was very innovative during that period. And some of our most famous inventions actually came from that time. But in the world of high tech, can Australia really afford to close itself off to the global economy? I would argue not. If we want to maintain reasonable costs, but also if we want to have access to the very best in the world. And this is technology around the internet around medicine, around a number of growth industries. So I think it's important that we get the balance right. But how much of that balance do we then refocus on Australia? It's my view that we can trade our way out of the challenge that we're currently in, but we need to be smart about it. We need to be very focused in Australia. We have very good capability. We've got some very strong industries in agriculture, in mining, in education, in tourism, but we also need to value add to those industries. So there's the argument that's saying rather than exporting expensive dirt from this country, what we should be doing is value adding. So with critical minerals, for example, rare earths and critical minerals, to value add to those products, to me, is an opportunity. We also have our mining sector that's regarded as the best in the world, and we have a number of companies that sit around the mining sector, the METS companies, and they're by definition also regarded as the best in the world. We've got a very robust, high-quality education system in this country. So it's not surprising that we also have very strong EdTech that sits around all levels of education. So these new businesses that are based on where Australia has competitive advantage will help to develop a more complex economy. And many of you will know about the Harvard report that talked about our economic complexity index. And Australia was down there at 94, and we were down with countries like Kazakhstan, Uganda and Senegal in terms of the complexity of our exports. Those countries are resource rich and they don't have very complex export profile. But there are other countries like Canada, Brazil, Russia that are in the top 50. So they are also resource rich economies, but they are much more diverse. They've got much more complexity in their exports. Even Norway, which is also resource rich, is up there at 41. So Australia has moved to a position where we're exporting goods, resources, but we're not adding as much as we could. There's lots of opportunities to actually do that. And I think we need to grow the complexity within our manufacturing sector around advanced manufacturing. And we have all the ingredients to do it. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, I'm quietly optimistic that Australia is actually going to grow from this situation, because we know that we have to be focused. So I'm not suggesting that we should decrease our resources exports. We're very fortunate to have such a strong resource industry, but we need an resources and what that will require is focus, absolutely relentless focus by government and by business working together in the areas of our competitive strength. I'm not suggesting that we necessarily pick winners in terms of specific companies, but in terms of sectors, it's my view that at this time, that relentless focus on sectors where we can be globally competitive and globally the best is where we should be heading. It should be our ambition. We have a very strong research and development sector in Australia and a number of other research entities in this country are also some of the best in the world. And we have an appetite now to actually align the research and development capability together with business and together with government. And as a team, if we feel that burning platform, if we acknowledge the burning platform and we decide that we are going to work together, and it's so encouraging to see the National Cabinet unprecedented collaboration. But I think now is the time also for business, government and our research entities to actually come together and to align the effort, and that will create progress for us.
Thanks, Stephanie. I particularly like your phrase, perhaps focus on competitive strengths. I think that's really interesting. I just want to pick up on a question that is on Pigeonhole, but also goes to a further kind of question around that relentless focus in future and Austrade's role. Stephanie, the issue of small and medium-sized businesses, and it came up yesterday, and obviously some of the disruption that we've seen in export markets may be a little bit discouraging to some. But there's been a question on Pigeonhole around how can Austrade and the corporate sector better support and facilitate supply chain opportunities for Indigenous business and enterprise. So be interested in your thoughts around SMEs more broadly and specifically to that point of Indigenous business and enterprise and Austrade in its role. I think you're on mute.
Okay, so in terms of SMEs, when we look at the industrial profile in Australia, we have a few large companies, but we have thousands and thousands of small, medium-sized enterprises, and probably more on the small side than on the medium side if you compare to Europe. And it's these SMEs who are really struggling with their supply chains. So one of the first things that Austrade did at the outbreak of the pandemic was to do a deep dive with over 600 companies, SMEs in particular. Some of them were our clients, some of them we knew very well, but some of them we didn't know very well. They were previously very successful companies, but then the pandemic actually took wind out of their sails. So what we did was then to do deep dives with each of those companies to identify the challenges for them to better position and target government policy. So as Alexandra said, Austrade is focusing on the client. We focus on the business. So we got intel from those businesses to help inform the targeting of government policy and government support. So with the SMEs, what we found was that their supply chains were quite complex, but I suppose the most surprising part is when you ask them about their supply chain, they knew about where they acquired inputs and probably where that business acquired the inputs. But after that, they lost sight of their supply chain. So they were only 2 steps. They only had visibility of 2 steps into their supply chain. And that creates a huge amount of risk, as Alexandra has been illustrating to us. We really do need to focus on the supply chain. There's been additional work on supply chain over the last 5-10 years because consumers have become very interested in where their products come from, whether there's child labour involved, for example, in some of the mining products or some textile products. So consumers are taking an increased interest in the supply chain. But what this pandemic has shown is that we need much more visibility of the supply chains, and that's why Alexandra's organisation is very important. But the SMEs see having a supply chain expert within their corporate office, they might only have 3 or 4 in the corporate office, to have another person just focusing on supply chain may represent a cost which they think is untenable. So that's why I think it's important that we start to socialise some of the costs of knowledge about supply chains across the SMEs. So a government agency like Austrade can help create visibility for the SMEs, and they don't have to pay for that knowledge necessarily, depends how complicated it becomes. But government can actually provide the support to the SMEs so they can actually manage their risk around supply chain. So I think the pandemic has actually refocused effort within government and onto issues that have become apparent as weaknesses within our industrial profile and certainly our export profile.
Alexandra, I might get you to weigh in at that point, because I know this issue of the capability of SMEs is something that you're quite focused on at the Supply Chain Institute as well. What do you see, in addition to organisations, working with Austrade and others, what can SMEs do in terms of building up this capability?
Yeah, as just said, it's all about the capabilities. I'm here to talk about supply chain as a whole, as a discipline, and we do in ASCI, together with UTS, annual surveys about the state of supply chain management. We carried out the last survey in November, and it was a bit disappointing because we dropped in our maturity levels. So the maturity level dropped by 6 percentage points down to 46. We measure in our survey, we reach out national, global, different corporation sizes and so on. We measured 8 key areas of supply chain management. And automation improved, as did compliance and regulation adherence. But we dropped the ball on risk management, procurement strategies, sustainability. So I strongly believe we need to further invest and really try to build the capabilities on our workforce for all the important exports and economical and stimulus packages and infrastructure projects which are coming up, because supply chain can really impact the financial results of a project or a company, as we know. At ASCI, I need to mention this as well, because ASCI is a supply chain institute, and we have, in the 90s, we had around half a dozen universities worldwide offering supply chain degrees. Nowadays, you have over 500. So also here in Australia, that's really fantastic. And I think that's really heavily needed, and also working together with technology. As technology, it always impacts supply chain. It can be, especially in the last months or years, you might be also aware of all the cyber threats, which immediately straight go into the supply chain. But I want to also highlight one of the initiatives ASCI is the accreditation scheme for registered practitioner here. We hear supply chain experts can apply for becoming a registered practitioner based on their qualification, but also based on their experiences, because that's very important to follow up on that as well, and continue to professional development. We have this scheme in place where the practitioner needs to prove 75 CBD points over 3 years, just to re-qualify to remain a qualified practitioner. And we strongly believe at ASCI this will help also Australia's industries to have a focus, a clear development, and being on the ball of the latest technologies. And it will help individuals as well to invest in their career path and getting also the focus back. As said, I think it's this competitiveness. We need the right policies in the background, but the people will drive all the innovation with their capabilities put back. And I would say, I would ask you just keep this in mind, but also, if you have time, visit your supply chain manager in your company, in your organization, and congratulate them for the work behind the scene, because supply chain managers do more than just looking after the inventory. They really support businesses to be successful.
Thanks, Alexandra. And I have noted in recent editions of the Financial Review that supply chain managers have been profiled. So perhaps, this is the next data science. It's seen as a sexy occupation. I want to go to the poll results. So just repeating that poll question, it was, with trade down between 10 to 30% due to the pandemic, do you believe that Australia can successfully influence free movement of goods and services at a time when protectionism is on the rise? The results of that, we've got the yeses at 22.3%, people who are unsure, 37%, no, 40.7%. I have to say, I find that a little bit surprising. Perhaps not the unsure part, but certainly the no's. Stephanie, I'm looking at you. What's your reaction to that poll?
I think the wording of the question may have encouraged people to say no in terms of how much influence Australia has. But I think together with like-minded countries, we have a lot of influence. And I think it's very important that Australia actually collaborates with countries who are of like mind. So there are a number of economies who are resisting protectionism, and Australia is very close to those economies. So Japan comes to mind, Japan, Korea, and the ASCI, so the equivalent of a free trade agreement with Indonesia, is coming into force on the 5th of July. And that's going to make trade between Australia and Indonesia a focus. And Australian business is very interested in Indonesia and vice versa. So it will mean that product coming into Australia from Indonesia will come in tariff-free, and just about all of Australian product going into Indonesia will go in tariff-free. So it's an unprecedented agreement, and Indonesia is a huge economy. It's being challenged at the moment, as every economy around the world is. But these free trade agreements actually provide Australia with opportunity, and Indonesia and Australia are actually complementary economies. So there is some optimism, but Australia doing it on our own, we have never tried to do it on our own. We have always sought to be part of coalitions, and our history around APEC, for example, Korea and Australia worked very closely together, and TPP, Australia and Japan worked very closely together. So with like-minded economies, I think Australia can be very influential, but not as a single economy. It needs to be done in coalition with like-minded economies.
I think it's a really important point, Stephanie. As we've seen the rhetoric on protectionism and the trade wars and so on, Australia's continued to sign and negotiate free trade agreements. We certainly have not stepped away that philosophy, and I think that's often goes unnoticed amongst the more exciting headlines around tensions and conflict. Alexandra, what did you make of that poll result? What would your members be thinking about that?
Yeah, I believe they were also focusing, yes, it's important especially to continue collaborating across the ocean and building up these relationships. I have to go back. We have the science behind us for supply chain discipline on the different ways, but it's all about staying in touch and in communicating with the people around that to make it happen. That's where we as supply chain people come from.
And I might just stick with you, Alexandra, for the last question. I think we've got about 5 minutes to go. The questions come in from Mitchell Durack around how quickly can we unwind the current practice of one supplier at the cheapest price? I think it probably goes a little bit to my question before around that sort of balancing act. But what's your view on that one?
I think it really depends on the business you are in and how much investment you want to take and what's the customer base. I see a lot of huge flexibility. If you just think back on all these positive changes in the last, forced changes, but positive innovation. We have heard the breweries switching over for the sanitizer production, and also how quickly hospitality adopted some of the new roles. I think it's really depending on the people. For some businesses, it might take longer. It's also always depending how deep you go into supply chain in your supplier base, how quickly, how deep your sub-suppliers are working. But I think we have plenty of opportunities. We have a huge stimulus pack. We have a fabulous country to work at with all the raw materials we have in place. We have fantastic universities. We have a fantastic education system. So it's all in our hands. I only believe we need to take the speed. We need to be on sort. Although speed is one thing, but we need to have really a proper supply chain design. And these designs need to be discussed in the boardrooms. I think it's very important to take it up there. And that's where you can then drive further the implementation. But we have already great examples. Some of them really were very, very quick. And also just think of the arts deliveries. Somehow, how many of our theatres went online to deliver it on the outside? It went really quick. It was out of necessity and really going with it was perhaps not nice to have, or it was not at all nice, or it was hard to get into this COVID situation, impacting so many livelihoods and people and economies. But we can find also some positives out of it. Innovation is growing.
Thank you, Alexandra. I'm conscious of time, but it's nice that we've had, Stephanie's talked about being quietly optimistic. You've talked about, some of the big opportunities that we have, and I think that's really the place to finish the conversation, but also to start the work ahead in terms of how we strengthen our global trade and supply chains coming out of this crisis, and in CEDA's sort of words, come back better. So I'd like to thank you both for your insights today. It's been a really great discussion. I'll remind all of our viewers that you can check out the series of blogs and information papers that we've done at CEDA on our website via the Coming Back Better tab. If I could ask for a round of applause right now, I would. And it's one of the saddest things about virtual is that we don't get that real-time feedback, but I'm sure that people would be applauding very loud right now if they could. And I'd like to suggest to people that they stick with us. The next session is going to start very shortly, led by Diane Smith-Gander on the labour market. So thank you very much for the discussion.